When people face hardships, their reactions tend to follow familiar patterns. Some sink into despair, some resign themselves to fate, some drift through life, some give up entirely. But there was one person in Chinese history who, after his life was completely upended, didn't stay in any of those places. He found a path that very few people take. His name was Bai Juyi. Most people remember him for his poems, the ones that ended up in textbooks. But what he truly left behind was something more fundamental: the ability to judge the direction of one's own life. In 815 AD, Bai Juyi was demoted and sent to Jiangzhou. Many people see this as a failure, but the more interesting question isn't why he failed. It's this: why did he believe in the first place that he wouldn't? To understand that, you have to go back to how he grew up. Bai Juyi's generation of scholars all walked the same road: study, pass the exams, enter officialdom. The path had been validated over and over, and it kept working. The lesson he absorbed from an early age was consistent: write well enough, score well enough, and advancement would follow. That lesson had never failed him. And so, he formed a very natural assumption: effort produces reward. The problem is that when a pattern succeeds for long enough, it becomes a default rule. He began to assume that the rules of the examination hall also applied to the world of officialdom. They didn't. In 815 AD, the chief minister Wu Yuanhing was assassinated in broad daylight on his way to court. The court was shaken, but silence followed. Many people knew what should be done. No one wanted to be the first to say it. Bai Juyi submitted a memorial. He stated the facts. He did what seemed to him like the obvious thing to do. His opponents didn't dispute his content. They didn't deny his facts. They seized on one point: you exceeded your authority. Months later, Bai Juyi was sent to Jiangzhou. He was 44 years old. He thought he had lost his career. It would take many years before he realized what had actually changed: the way he saw the world. In his first year in Jiangzhou, Bai Juyi wrote the Song of the People. We are both adrift at the edges of the world. What does it matter that we never met before? Through the story of a musician, he wrote about his own situation, and Jiangzhou began to change something in him. He had always believed that if he was principled enough, diligent enough, things would shift. But now he saw that belief for what it was, built on a premise he had never actually tested. What truly determines outcomes here? Many people reach a point in their lives where they hit the same wall. You suddenly find that not everything can be solved by trying harder. Not because you did something wrong, but because you assume the place you were in worked the way you imagined it did. Accepting the distance between those two things is the hardest step, and the beginning of real change. After that acceptance, Bai Juyi didn't face a simple choice. One path was to resign entirely, but he had a family to support, and that wasn't realistic. Another path was to keep fighting, to prove he was right, but he had already seen what that cost. The real shift was this: he began to see a boundary clearly, how the court regarded him, how his opponents attacked him, how circumstances shifted. None of that was in his control, but what he could decide was where his time and energy went each day. Once he saw that boundary, he finally knew which things were worth holding onto and which he simply had to accept. Later, Bai Juyi sought out positions that carried the title but little power. The salary was not low, but real authority was gone, and no one had reason to trouble him. From the outside, people saw him writing poems, tending his garden, drinking wine in Luoyang, and assumed he had simply given up. He hadn't. He hadn't stopped making effort. He had stopped wasting effort. On battles, he had almost no chance of winning. In a poem called Zhong Yin, The Middle Way of Withdrawal, he wrote down what he had come to understand. You don't need to retreat to the mountains to truly step back. And you don't need to exhaust yourself at court to prove you still stand for something. A person's most limited resource in this life is never ability. It is time, attention, and the finite investment of one life. What changed for Bai Juyi wasn't his ability. It was the direction of that investment. He began putting his time and energy toward what he could actually control and what could actually produce something of value. Poetry, his garden, the company of people who shared his spirit. This wasn't the ease of a comfortable post. It was the steadiness that comes from clarity, and that kind of clarity is available to anyone. You don't need a quieter position. You just need to ask yourself honestly, the thing you work hardest at every day, is it actually taking you where you want to go? This kind of clarity doesn't come from a single decision. Bai Juyi spent his whole life returning to the same question. Is the time and the energy I'm spending today actually worth it? That ongoing self-examination mattered more than any single choice he made. Bai Juyi lived to 75, a rare span for that era. What he left behind wasn't only the poems, it was a way of thinking about one's own life. Maturity isn't becoming more and more hardworking. It's knowing more and more clearly what is worth working for.